Welcome to your next video lecture in our Unit 4 continuation. Today's video lecture is going to be on modules 5.1a and b, part 1, which is the first part of looking at stress and how we experience stress.
So we start with the question, stress, what is it? And stress is any circumstance, real or perceived, and that's what's really important, real or perceived, that threatens a person's well-being. So stress is not universal. Stress doesn't look the same for everybody. For example, my husband and I, who are both experiencing what some would call a stressful situation, maybe moving, maybe having a new child, maybe getting a new job, he might perceive getting a new job or a house in a different way than I perceive getting a new job or getting a new house. And based on our perception will impact how much stress we experience, how much of a threat we see this as, how much of a threat of our well-being we see this as. And so stress is not something universal, but a lot of it is our perception of what is stressful versus what is not. So how do we experience stress? Probably one of the most common concepts that I've seen across all AP Psych exams is the general adaptation syndrome that's created by Hans Selye, S-E-Y-L-E. Selye came up with this model as to how we experience stress that happens. So he thought we went through three phases, and if you look here in the chart, or in the picture, you'll see that stress occurs. That's phase one. That's called alarm. All of a sudden, real or perceived, there is stress around us. Again, real or perceived. Then all of a sudden, once we notice that there is an alarm and we start to kind of mobilize our resources both physically and physiologically and psychologically, try and get all of our bearings together, then we move into this resistance phase. And the resistance phase is the time period when we are coping with the stress, when we're dealing with whatever it is that's causing us real or perceived stress. And then either when that situation ends or when our body can no longer resist that stress, we move into our exhaustion stage, which is phase 3. And during phase 3, during that exhaustion stage is when we are most vulnerable to illness. We're most vulnerable to a common cold, most vulnerable to diseases such as heart disease, most vulnerable to not be able to fight off infection any longer. And so the longer we're in that resistance, the less our body is able to cope with that stressor and may automatically put our body into that exhaustion stage. Or you might find, you are stressed leading up to the end of the school year. You're really stressed during that finals weekend, and all of a sudden the first day of summer break is when you find you are most sick. When all of a sudden the first day of summer you find yourself at the doctor or you find yourself sleeping all day. Well, you've entered into that exhaustion stage where you are most prone to those illnesses. So as soon as that stress goes away, that's when we typically end up getting sick. What can prolonged stress do to us? I don't think I'm telling you anything new, but I am showing you some support of research that backs this up. If you look at the top right, you'll see percentage of people with colds, and you'll see individuals with chronic stress versus no chronic stress. In the blue is no chronic stress, in the red is chronic stress. You see there's almost a 15% increase in your likelihood of experiencing colds when you have prolonged stress for a month, 3 months, and then you can see it at 6 months. So in any capacity, that causes a lot more stress. We also see that stress kills. We see that it's been medically proven to increase your chance of heart disease, high blood pressure, colitis, skin allergies, kidney disorders, irritability, you name it, it's connected to stress. And then in the bottom, you can see effects of stress on your body. Brain, we see increase in depression and anxiety. Heart, again, increasing that risk of heart disease. Lungs, strained breathing. Stomach, you can get ulcers, and frequent muscle and joint pains. So prolonged stress is not good for anybody. And again, because stress is real or perceived, individuals who perceive their environment as really stressful are just as vulnerable to this as individuals who have larger stressors that are more universally perceived as stressful going on. What else impacts our experience of stress is our personality type. We've probably heard before the difference between type A and type B personalities and which one is more prone to experiencing high amounts of stress. And when we look at who's more prone, type A is much more prone to increased stress and therefore much more likely to experience disease. Some of the personality traits of type A tend to be more impatient, less comfortable around others, become angry when other people try and hold them back, prefer to work alone, resent being told what to do, work faster even when there's no pressure or deadline involved, complains less about hard works, does more poorly on tasks requiring patience or careful, considerate judgment, and do better on tasks involving time pressure and solitary work. In contrast, type Bs tend to be more comfortable around others, tend to prefer to work in teams versus individually. Actually, a fun fact that I think most of you might confuse with type A is that type B, most members of top management and successful managers tend to have type B characteristics over type A. Type B also does well on tasks requiring patience or careful, considerate judgment, and do better on tasks for accuracy rather than speed. So reflecting on yourself, do you tend to have more characteristics of the type A or type B? With that being said, what does your level of stress look like in compared to perhaps your friends who have a different personality type? So if we can make changes to that type A lifestyle, we can help with our perceived interpretation of stress. We can therefore lessen our stress and lessen the likelihood that we are going through those 3 phases and inevitably continually entering into that exhaustion stage, which, as we know, when we enter that exhaustion stage, we are more prone to illness. So if we can find a way to modify that, we can avoid ourselves going into that alarm and subsequent resistance and finally exhaustion stage so often. So you see, this is a chart of research where they had control patients or individuals who did not modify their lifestyles. And then we had individuals in the experimental group who modified their type A lifestyles. And we see the difference when we look 4 years later, the percentage of individuals who experienced reoccurring heart attacks versus the percentage of those that didn't. We see that there is a difference with just that one variable being changed. So it is possible to change this about yourself. It's not set in stone. You can do things to actively modify this lifestyle. There's also a new field in psychology, well, relatively new, called health psychologists. And health psychologists focus on this general adaptation syndrome, and they look at these 3 steps at phase 1, the alarm, phase 2, resistance, phase 3, exhaustion. And they look at the medical professionals. And medical professionals tend to jump in during phase 3, once you face exhaustion, once all of a sudden your throat is not feeling well, so you go to the doctor, or once you start to feel run down, you go to the doctor. All those things happen during the exhaustion stage. And health psychologists come in and say, you know what, we should really be focusing on looking before we even enter into phase 1. How can we reduce the amount of phase 1s we enter? Therefore, cutting down on how many people enter into the exhaustion stage. If we had helped people modify their type A lifestyle, if we can help people not perceive certain situations as stressful, we can lower the number of individuals who are entering into this general adaptation syndrome and therefore better the physical and psychological health of our community. So health psychologists really focus on the prevention versus when we look at like medical doctors, they tend to come in on the other end on what do we do now that you have said disorder or said illness. How do we deal with stress? There's 2 different ways in which psychologists have identified we deal with stress, and one is problem-focused coping and one is emotion-focused coping. Typically, when we feel like we have control over our situation, when we feel like what we do makes a difference, we use more problem-focused coping, where we actually go to the source of the problem and deal with that issue head-on. When we perceive that we don't have control in a situation, we tend to use more emotion-focused coping, where we look at what are the emotional repercussions of this stress and how can I address those emotions to make myself feel better. For example, let's say this class or another class you perceive as really stressful and you see that what I do matters. The more time I put into listening to those video lectures, asking questions in class, doing those active studying techniques, the more I do that, the more I see that I can succeed. Well, you're more likely to use problem-focused coping when you find we hit a unit that's really challenging because you perceive control of the outcome of your grade in this course. If perhaps on the other hand, you don't see that you have a lot of control in this course and you don't feel like what you do makes that difference, you're more likely when faced with a very stressful unit that you don't really understand to use emotion-focused coping. That in light of you not doing well on that unit, you feel sad, frustrated, angry, fill in the blank with emotion, you are going to then try and find ways to deal with all those said emotions in order to make yourself feel better. You might eat a lot of ice cream because it makes you feel better. You might complain about it to a friend. You might sleep. You might do things to fix the emotions that you experience, but you're not actually fixing the problem. So one of the ways we can help individuals use more problem-focused coping is if we can help them see that they can control and change that stressful situation. That's it for now. I hope you have a wonderful day.